The introduction in English starts around minute 2.5. Olá, o meu nome é José Maria Pimentel e este é o 45 graus. Para quem já se tornou cliente dos episódios em vídeo, este é um episódio só em áudio, só com som, por motivos logísticos, mas não se preocupem que o vídeo volta já no próximo episódio. Este é também um episódio diferente do normal, por ser em inglês, com um convidado, ou convidada neste caso, estrangeiro. Como sabe, quem ouve o podcast já há muito tempo, é uma coisa que eu gosto de fazer de vez em quando o tema justifica ter convidados estrangeiros. Ainda recentemente, aliás, com o Tom Chatfield, no episódio 162. Embora, no outro dia, tenha ido ver os números de downloads, que é uma coisa que eu não faço assim com tanta regularidade, e confirmei a impressão que já tinha de que perco cerca de 30% de downloads neste tipo de episódios, o que é uma pancada grande, mas ainda assim, pelo menos para mim e para 70% de vocês, justifica que eu continuo a fazer estes episódios de vez em quando. E agora ao episódio em si. O tema de hoje é a revolução digital que estamos a viver e, em particular, a estratégia da União Europeia para lidar com ela, que tem tentado, basicamente, quadrar o círculo, tentando, por um lado, regular os riscos destas tecnologias e, ao mesmo tempo, gerar mais inovação na área do digital na Europa. Os temas da tecnologia e do mundo digital sempre me interessaram, ou não estivessemos num podcast, que é basicamente uma espécie de rádio digital, mas a verdade é que sobre as políticas da União Europeia para esta área, concretamente, eu tinha até há pouco tempo uma ideia apenas vaga. E não era sequer uma ideia especialmente positiva, porque era muito influenciada pelas críticas, que vocês de certeza também já ouviram por aí, que normalmente não fogem muito da piada de que enquanto os Estados Unidos inovam e criam grandes empresas, a especialidade da Europa é basicamente regular. Mas a verdade é que tenho vindo a mudar a minha visão desde que passei a colaborar de perto com a DG Connect, que é o departamento da Comissão Europeia responsável por esta área, no meu papel de embaixador digital, que é um grupo que reúne pessoas ativas no mundo digital e que vão basicamente, de consultores nesta área até influencers, portanto é um espectro muito largo e que vem dos diferentes países da União. Nas viagens que nos últimos tempos tenho feito a Bruxelas e em discussões com quem lá trabalha, fui percebendo que, na verdade, existe na União Europeia uma visão para o mundo digital que, não estando imune a críticas, é multifacetada e a olhar para o futuro. E por isso decidi que estava na altura de trazer este tema ao podcast. A convidada é Renate Nikolay, que é diretora adjunta, precisamente na DG Connect, e é alguém que, como vão perceber, defende a visão da União Europeia para esta área de uma maneira muito coerente. E agora, para não limitar a audiência do episódio, vamos mudar para inglês. We are living through a digital revolution. Apps like Instagram, Twitter and TikTok have become the new town squares where we catch up, we share news and we champion the causes close to our hearts. Also, the so-called platform economy is getting bigger and bigger, with companies like Amazon, Airbnb and Uber controlling an increasing share of the world's economy. And with the pandemic, platforms like Zoom or Slack suddenly replaced for many of us our office spaces. And then there's artificial intelligence with increasingly powerful generative AI models coming out every month since ChatGPT was launched back at the end of 2022. As with any revolution, the digital world creates both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it has the potential to generate economic growth and improve our lives in many ways. But on the other, it creates a real danger of cyber attacks, it spreads disinformation, and creates a real risk of us losing our privacy. And it doesn't stop there. The digital world is also becoming a geopolitical chess game. Take the chip crisis during the pandemic, for example. Suddenly, everyone is stuck at home, craving new gadgets, and boom! There's not enough chips, also known as semiconductors, to go around, because Europe imports a big part of the components it uses. For a period, this messed up everything from cars to medical gadgets, where suddenly there were no devices for everyone. All of this makes it necessary for governments to take action. But it's not easy. In the European Union, in particular, there is a difficult circle that policymakers need to square. In a union comprised of democratic countries, where human rights and the rule of law are respected, we need to make sure citizens' rights are also defended in the online world. But at the same time, we also need to ensure that Europe has economic security, such as guaranteeing the supply of chips, and that its economy becomes more competitive in the digital arena. And while Europe is top of the mark in education and science, the fact is that we have been getting behind in the digital race, with few big innovations and few big tech giants coming from the continent. So something needs to be done here as well. Over the last few years, the EU has been putting out a huge number of policies encompassing regulation focused on protecting our rights online and measures aimed at creating digital capabilities and boosting innovation in the continent. Indeed, one thing EU policymakers cannot be criticized for better or worse, is inaction. The EU is by far the world's most proactive policymaker in this area. And the fact is that other countries are already copying many of these measures in another instance of what has become known in recent years as the Brussels effect. In this episode, we will delve into the EU's digital strategy to understand what it is and the main initiatives that are being implemented or will be so in the coming years. My guest is Renate Nikolay, who works at the European Commission as Deputy Director at DG Connect, which is the Directorate-General for Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. We covered a lot of ground in our 30-minute conversation. I started by asking Renate to give an overview of the EU digital strategy. She highlights how EU policies towards AI are a case in point in this strategy, because they have taken different measures in the last couple of years, both to ensure that AI doesn't harm our safety and privacy, but also to make European firms more competitive in this area. For instance, the EU has created a network of supercomputers that are available for European AI startups to scale up their technologies. But many people in the sector also criticize EU regulation, such as the AI Act, claiming it will stifle innovation and lead international investors away from the continent. In the regulation realm, we also talked about the piece of regulation that's probably most familiar to most of you, the DSA, the Digital Services Act. The DSA sets strict rules for online platforms such as Instagram, X or YouTube, ranging from illegal content to advertising and protection of minors. And we also discussed another important initiative, which conversely is probably not that known but should be, the Digital Decade Policy Programme. This is a set of very ambitious goals set by the EU and member states to be achieved by 2030 in order to push Europe to the top of the digital league. They include, for instance, having 100% of key government services online, offering to citizens everywhere high-speed mobile coverage, at least 5G, and doubling the number of European unicorn startups. What makes this initiative, in my view, very much worth keeping an eye on is that these are concrete targets that the Commission and national governments have committed to achieve, which means that we, citizens, can track them and see whether or not they are achieved by 2030. Another target in the digital decade is to double from 10 to 20% the share of the world's semiconductors produced in the continent. I also asked Renate about this, since this is, as I mentioned before, a key element in ensuring Europe's strategic autonomy. And now, so much for the introduction, I leave you with Renate Nikolay. Renate, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Very nice to have you here. So let's start with some context. The digital revolution, as it were, has been going on for, I don't know, it depends on how you count it, but at least in full force, I'd say in the last 15 years, and with different impacts on the economy, on society, on people's lives. And that creates a lot of opportunities, but also challenges that have been interpreted differently by different people and in different geographies. So the interpretation in the US is not the same as in Europe and in the EU in particular. So what would you say is the view of the EU on the opportunities and challenges brought by digital?
Well, I think in the EU we have a rather long kind of approach on creating the digital single market. I mean, this is not a theme that has been invented only in the last couple of years. I mean, this has been with us for more than a decade as an idea to really also use the biggest kind of, advantage that we have in the European Union, which is our single market, for kind of, digital advancements. However, I think it is fair to say that maybe in a first phase, we looked more at it from a regulatory point of view. So when you look back, I mean, this was the early days of the data protection rules. That was a conscious choice of Europe to kind of start with that. Others did not. Others kind of went into kind of, creating the social media companies in Silicon Valley. This would probably not have been possible in Europe because of a mix of things, venture capitalism not at the same level, the skills from the kind of, engineering point of view not at the same level. But nevertheless, it was an important contribution from Europe because what we did with the GDPR had an influence on the world because we inspired the world with our principles on data protection. I think what we have been doing in the last couple of years is a slightly different approach to this, really capturing, as you said very well, the challenges and opportunities at the same time. So as Europe, we stand for values and we also kind of, tend to discuss the things up front. So we have seen that kind of digital transitions can have super opportunities, but also present challenges. Let's take the challenge of platform economy. Great advantage. I think we all learned a great deal in the COVID times to kind of use them. They kept us alive. They kept us connected. But we also saw that they can, of course, create harm for society, illegal content, disinformation, safety of minors, and so on. So, we felt we needed to kind of guardrail a little bit. Or let's take the other example of AI. Yes, we want AI applications in Europe. We see it as a huge possibility, but we stand for certain AI. We stand for a human-centric ethical AI, which means that there are some very, very limited, but there are some guardrails where we say no. For instance, social scoring, that's not for us, that we don't want in Europe. So, but nevertheless, this kind of regulatory, let's say, risk-based approach, so smart regulation, not over-regulating, rather principles-based, leaving space for future innovation, is, however, accompanied with a real innovation agenda. And I think that's the kind of opportunities part. AI is the best example. We have the AI Act, but it's kind of combined with an AI innovation package because the race for AI is out there. And Europe needs to be a full participant in this race and has very good ingredients to do so. If you think about all the industrial sectors where if we now use the opportunities, use the data we have, use the supercomputing power we have, use the guardrails that we have to really kind of, move to the next digital innovation step on AI, then we can play a role, a first league in the future. So I think that's been the game changer, that people have realized that the future competitiveness will inevitably be depending also on our ability to have digital solutions embedded in it. Whether it's smart agriculture, smart energy solutions, smart, mobility solutions, telemedicine, you name it. So we need to play a part in that. That's why it's not only a regulatory approach, it's also an approach to really use it as an opportunity. And AI is probably the best example because it's so much talked about at the moment. It has challenges, but offers huge opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in AI, the EU has clearly policies towards both goals, so at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's probably the best example. I think it's embedded in a lot of what we do. When you take, for instance, the data, I spoke about the data protection approach in the past, but in this mandate, we have rolled out a data strategy. We have kind of enacted things like the Data Act. We are working on data spaces. This is a total game changer. This is going, again, not forgetting about data protection. This is an important foundation, but this doesn't mean that you cannot use data. So it's kind of putting the focus a little bit away from data protection only to the huge potential of also industrial data, in particular of connected goods, because they will be the ingredient. The data is the ingredient for the future AI applications, for whatever we want to do on digital transition. We need to base it on data. So again, an example of an enabling policy rather than a guardrailing that is only, creating compliance costs.
Yeah, I find it interesting that, well, it's very ambitious that you're trying to kind of square the circle in a sense, because you're trying to ensure the online world is safe, is fair on the one hand, mainly through regulation, but then on the other hand, also trying to make sure Europe catches the digital wave, as it were. So boosting capabilities, boosting innovation here. That's a big challenge. But what I find interesting and I find different from what happens elsewhere in the sense that in other areas, is that it's the same people drafting policies towards both goals, because usually those two roles are split, right? You have the kind of the regulation people and the innovation people, and you have the same, well, it's probably not the same team, but the same directorate in this case, taking care of the two goals that are different in a sense, but they are also very much connected, because you cannot go too far in one without ensuring the other.
It's really this new concept. And I never believed in this kind of, narrative that it's either innovation or regulation. That's nonsense. They can kind of coexist. You can reconcile the one with the other, Europe stands for certain things, When we see that there is a platform economy that kind of leads to deep divisions in kind of society, that leads to radicalization online, that kind of leads to the spread of illegal hate speech, we need to act, We cannot have one set of rules for the offline reality, but not respect the same rules for the online reality. So that's a non-brainer, what we did on platform economy, to simply kind of follow the concept of what is illegal offline has to be illegal online, but it had to be said. And always, of course, in full kind of balancing with the freedom of speech. But at the same time, of course, we want to be not only consuming the digital solutions coming from elsewhere, we want to be an actor in this. We want to kind of design the future digital solutions, in medicine, in kind of automated driving, because we have huge potential, especially on the industrial side, to play that role. Supercomputers is a good example, It is a kind of technological project that we worked on together in the EU, but it's kind of an ingredient for a lot of the things that we want to do in the digital transition, because if you don't have the computing power, you kind of, leave our startups that might have interesting AI application ideas in the hands of the big American hyperscalers, because they need to go there. They need to be kind of swallowed by them, because that's the only way to test their models. So that's what we need to facilitate. We also need to facilitate an infrastructure in Europe that they can stay here, can grow here, can adapt here, and can develop their innovations here.
Mm. Let's go a bit deeper on first on the regulation front. So let's take, for instance, the DSA, which you mentioned before. The DSA is focused a lot on removing illegal content, making sure these companies are transparent on what they're doing, on what the algorithm is selecting for us in terms of advertisement, for instance. How do you say this relates to broader goals that you mentioned of fighting disinformation that's polarizing society and polarizing politics through, fake news and whatnot? How do you say, or what would you say is the role of the DSA on that?
I think the DSA is a part of our whole society approach on addressing disinformation. Disinformation is a phenomenon that you cannot swip something on and off. It's not like that. It's much more complex, because you need to address it really in a kind of holistic approach. And I think what we've been seeing over the last years, because there have been disinformation, conspiracy theories, campaigns during COVID, ever since the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and you name it, on the Green Deal, there are these narratives out there, and we've all learned to kind of pay more attention to that. So, there's a much more kind of, stronger basis to analyze the kind of the disinformation waves. There's a much bigger awareness in the society on disinformation. Where we come in with the DSA is indeed, the DSA is a transparency tool, is a tool to kind of deal with systemic risks. And amongst systemic risks is also the kind of the potential spread of disinformation. So where we can come in is actually to hold the platforms accountable in a content agnostic way. We're not about content. We are about kind of, looking at the platform structure, their recommender systems, their algorithms, and what they do when they kind of see disinformation kind of waves, which are being flagged to them by kind of fact checkers, for instance, or by media or by individuals, and how to deal with that, how they kind of tame the spread of it, how they tame the kind of the reality and the speed of it. That's the kind of, structural thing we can do. So at the moment, for instance, where we are heading for elections in Europe, it really shows that this whole society approach is what is needed here. Because, the platform, they play their role. They have really kind of, stepped up their game in terms of abiding with the DSA rules, having incidence protocols. When something like the shooting in Slovakia with regard to the prime minister happened, to really have immediately an incident protocol so that the work kind of, plan can follow. But also being much more aware of the fact-checking community that comes in and makes them aware. So what we are seeing is that disinformation still exists. Of course, we're getting daily reports from the fact checkers, and they are still there, this narrative, but what seems to go quite well at the moment, but of course we have to keep on our toes, is that because of the system that we have created with the higher accountability, with more transparency, with platform responsibility, we actually tame the reach. So we keep it quite under control, because, by flagging it, by kind of, debunking it, by kind of demonetizing it, you manage that this is not kind of creating the kind of the spread and the virality and the echo chambers that people are only kind of driven driven by that. And that we need to do because, disinformation has become a topic that is on the agenda of every European Council by now. This is prime minister topic. This is not just some freaks or some people in DG Connect who think about that. This has become a key issue for our society, for our democracy, and we need to be aware of that. We need to do it in full respect of freedom of speech, but we need to be aware of the systems behind, the actors behind, so that we are not naive, but actually address this in a very systemic way.
It's interesting what you said. So, because you have an interesting point of comparison in that you have the European elections that are going on right now and the ones that we had last time around. So do you feel already that there's a difference, a material difference?
Oh, big time. I've been involved in that in a different role already 5 years ago, because I was then working as head of cabinet more on the data protection side with the then Justice Commissioner Vera Jourova. And there was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, if you remember that,
Yes.
from Facebook, a big kind of data violation scandal. And of course, it created a whole debate about this. And that was also one of the ingredients that brought about a code of practice against disinformation, which was a self-regulatory approach with the platforms for the first time to bring the different constituencies together. Civil society, fact checkers asked the platforms to kind of deal with that in a systemic way. But it was, of course, not hard law. It was a self-regulatory approach. So all that was created just before the European Parliament elections. Also the work with the member states and their election authorities. It was all very early days. There weren't kind of systemic workflows, There weren't kind of, incident protocols. There weren't kind of, threat assessments. We are in a much better shape. Doesn't mean that we should be complacent. We still have to really remain on our toes, especially now in the countdown moment, in the last days before and also after the elections, because then there's other vulnerabilities with the candidates coming out of it. But nevertheless, what I am very proud of, and I know that the world is also quite watching what Europe is doing here, because there are many elections in the world, and they look at, how we play with these rules, is that we really have by now an ecosystem that is really well united and well kind of, has really kind of worked and it's cooperating much better compared to 5 years ago. It hasn't been fully tested yet, but when you look at also the input from the cyber world, because we're working also with the people who really observe the potential cyber threats, there's a much better cooperation with the other institutions. I have not seen 5 years ago the same cooperation with the European Parliament, the Commission, the Council as we see it now. The member states are much more aware. So, I don't know whether you know, but we have done a couple of weeks ago a tabletop exercise with a lot of these players to really go through scenarios. You do that a lot in cybersecurity. We have never done that on election integrity. This was a very, very useful exercise to really play through. And these were all scenarios that we have observed, and they were at different scales. And it was really a good exercise to kind of just think through it. It's still a little bit artificial in a tabletop, but nevertheless, it kind of shapes your mind. It makes you more alert. And I definitely believe it has an effect. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see at the moment disinformation is there, but we are taming it. So let's hope it will stay that way.
Yeah, interesting. Let's turn back to AI we were discussing before, which, as you said, is an interesting area because you have been enacting policies in both ends, both in the regulation side and in the kind of innovation boosting side. You mentioned the supercomputers, and it has been one of the most interesting fronts to follow in my role as digital ambassador, because to be fair, I didn't know the EU was doing so much in this area. What I find, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that you felt that you needed to step in order to provide these capabilities, in this case the supercomputers, to make sure that European startups are able to grow, because otherwise they wouldn't have access to it in the way that American startups do, right? Because there they have these big, large companies that themselves have supercomputers, and they can, either through partnerships or through acquiring smaller companies, they can use those capabilities. And here, if it weren't for the EU stepping in, that would be a void there in which startups wouldn't be able to grow, right?
You're absolutely right. I think no Germany, no Denmark, no Portugal, no Czechia alone would have been able to kind of create the scale of the supercomputers we're talking about here. Really top-notch, world-class supercomputing power that you need to kind of deal with the amount of data that will be the ingredient for any kind of digital kind of advancement in the future. And I think it was a very intelligent kind of, process that started years years ago, to look at that in a kind of a joined up way. So it's not one country, it's really kind of a collection. It's kind of looking at geography. There's one in Finland, there's one in Barcelona, and so on. So really to kind of cover a little bit also the geography and to really invest heavily in this. And I think we can say with pride as Europeans that through that, it's heavy investment, it's co-investment. It comes a lot of money from the European Union, but also from the member states. But it has paid off because indeed we now have these kind of, potential structures that can be used. With the AI Act, it became necessary to facilitate even more than was the case so far, that these kind of, in this dynamic process, especially on generative AI, if you think about it, you really need to give the possibilities to the startups right away and easy access to the supercomputing power. And that's why we made even an adjustment to the setup of these, supercomputers, that now there's really an easy access. So the door's wide open for AI startups to kind of come and, run their applications on these supercomputers so that then hopefully they can kind of develop this further in the EU. And I think the idea of the AI innovation package, when you think about is this idea of the AI factories, is really that you create ecosystems around certain centers, excellence centers in Europe. And that's the other thing. Future European competitiveness needs to think about, the geography of the single market as such. And then you have certain ecosystems where, let's take Barcelona. I was there. I looked at Mare Nostrum, and it's fascinating when you see it. It's a very vibrant kind of economic kind of, context there. You have university set up, so you have the skills also that you need, because we also have a skills shortage issue in Europe that we need to address better. But, in these ecosystems, you have them at the places where you have an academic kind of context where you, provide also the skills input. You have an innovative kind of context with startups. So it's a wonderful kind of ecosystem that can then kind of develop and from there grow and really kind of serve, of course, the European competitiveness as a whole. And I think that's very smart to have this at different places in the EU, maybe also with specificities, the AI factories could be in medicine, they could be in agriculture. We have to go for the areas where we have a strong industrial base and then move it from there. But, it was smart to invest in the supercomputers. And now we have to be smart to think of the next technological kind of issues. And that's where quantum computing comes in.
Yeah. And it's unconventional also in a sense that, at least in comparison with the US, where it would be unlikely to see the state, so the public funds stepping in to fund these supercomputers, which there it would be probably less likely to happen, right?
Yeah, you're right about that, because their, of course, whole kind of startup scene has, they have a really different tradition on venture capitalism. The Silicon Valley was possible because they had huge amounts of money in venture capitalist structures, hugely open for risk taking, and they kind of invested in 10 ideas and one made it. And the rest was kind of, that's part of the game. But on the other hand, look at the US. They have done the IRA. This is huge subsidies. So I wouldn't say that.
No, subsidies they do. Yeah, subsidies
I
they
wouldn't
do.
say that in the US everything is market driven only, and we are the ones coming with. I think we are different, but we are all addressing the same challenges. We are in a slightly kind of changing geopolitical context. We are in a systemic rivalry. So we all have to kind of look for the best way to support our, economic security, our kind of strategic autonomy, and our future competitiveness. And this is what this is about. And Europe is stronger when we join forces and when we kind of, identify areas where we can have our strength and pull our weight together. And that's, I think, what worked really well in the supercomputers.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is probably the question you get the most, I guess, which is the criticism on the AI Act. Well, much of it actually comes from the US or from American companies. And I find that it's largely unfair, but it's also understandable. And what I wanted to ask you is this. So I was recently reading, I don't know if you caught it, but there's a recent paper by Anu Bradford who famously coined the term Brussels effect.
Brussels effect, yeah.
Maybe we'll talk about that. And she has an interesting recent paper tackling this issue. And her point, which I very much agree with, is that it's not because of regulation that Europe is behind the US on the digital front. It's because obviously of other aspects that have to do, well, for instance, with access to capital that you mentioned. So this I find to be true, but it's still possible that with these fragilities, regulation will affect the EU more than it would affect actually the US. So if you have already a fragile ecosystem, for instance, regulation on AI that has to be prescriptive and that this is kind of the argument against it, that might stifle innovation in the sense that companies, well, there's a lot of that they need to comply with, and there are some things that they cannot do. So in the end, we don't know what the AI of the future will look like. So in Europe, maybe they won't be able to experiment with some things that in the US they can, and so it will kind of put European firms further behind on these firms. So this is probably an argument to get a lot.
I don't buy that argument. I want you to kind of, open more for the idea that the AI Act is really a piece of smart regulation. This is not about prohibiting things. If you look at what the AI Act does, then it has very, very few things. It's really just the social scoring mainly, where we say, this is not for Europe. We don't want that. This is not a society
we're not going
we
there.
want.
Yeah.
Exactly. Very, very limited. Then it has this approach on high risk. Very limited again, very limited sectors. And high risk does not mean we don't want AI there. I mean, let's take one example. In the judiciary, of course, we don't want to fully replace judges. You need to have a fair trial, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, to have the kind of in the judiciary, a high risk nuance in it, or also in the labor market, has to do with, we want to avoid that we deepen bias, that we deepen discrimination in our society. So it doesn't mean it's forbidden. It's more is, we want you to have to ensure that you have a certain ex ante vision on this. You take into account certain safeguards before you kind of develop it. And that's a fair kind of thing. We had a similar discussion on privacy years ago. The idea of privacy by design was seen as, this is going to stifle innovation. But actually, it can also be in a competitive advantage if you have thought it through, because, one concept could be you let it kind of develop and then you have to crash and then you bring it to court and you litigate. American way. Or you say, hey, here, this is high risk. So let's think it through from the beginning, but it doesn't mean that we close the door, and that will be the majority of the AI applications, because the majority will not be in high risk areas. The majority will be open the gates. The AI Act is not limiting it at all. Rather the opposite. The AI Act is kind of, supporting industry initiatives to kind of, come together, sandboxing, the AI kind of innovation package next to it. So I think it's actually a promise of the European Union that we want to support AI applications made in the EU. So I would really kind of argue against that. The AI Act is an example of how Europe leads again on limiting. I think we have to have that narrative also, that political narrative. And I think when you look at the Letta report, or when you kind of, hopefully it will be reflected also on the Draghi report, they also show, when you look at the statements of leaders, just the recent kind of statement of the German-French kind of, leaders, everybody knows that the digital critical technologies are key for the future competitiveness in the EU. This was a key debate also in the final stretches of making the AI Act a reality. So it's built in. Generative AI, another kind of thing. It's very dynamic. It's very fast. Again, we are not saying it cannot be done, but we want to kind of, have certain kind of standards. And on this, actually, I see on the AI Act much more convergence internationally than I would have thought would happen if you had asked me a year ago. When you look at the Hiroshima process launched by the Japanese, or now all these AI summits, every week you have somewhere an AI summit. I mean, it's quite interesting, And, there's really an appetite for partners in the world to come closer together on the key principles for, a human-centric AI. And here, I think the AI Act is actually the inspiration. So I would,
it's the Brussels effect. There it is.
Yeah, de facto, it is already a Brussels effect. But I think you have a point. We have to make clear that we do not forget this innovation side, and we have to push this really, really, thoroughly, so that this is not forgotten and it's accompanied by concrete action, so that we are not only talking about AI factories, but we actually make it work.
Yeah, and they're one of maybe my favorite initiative, which I find is insufficiently known, is the Digital Decade Program, because there you have very concrete targets, which are not very far away. So it's 2030. So it's actually not very far away. And they are targets on which there's a commitment by the EU to meet them. So if they are not met, well, you guys will have to justify why they weren't met. Well, I find the range of targets quite encompassing, and I find it very brave to commit on. It's not something, I was even having this conversation with a friend the other day. It's not something governments and public entities usually do, to commit with targets. So I find that brave.
You're right. It's rare that the three institutions come together, with that kind of decade perspective. And, I'm chairing the Digital Decade Board. So I can tell you also from my experience in dealing with the member states representatives who have all their coordination role in having a whole government approach, because it's not one ministry leading here on this. I mean, these are targets. They go in the area of skills. They go in the area of public administration, digitalization, business, digitalization, connectivity. I mean, this is broad. You really need a whole government approach if you really want to mind a push. I see that they are all kind of coming with national strategies. You will soon have the next Digital Decade report. It's not going to be rosy. we are a bit off target, so to say. So we have to roll up our sleeves.
Of setting targets.
But I mean, honestly, what the positive thing is that we're on the road. I mean, that's definitely much more the case compared to a year ago. And it's a good ingredient also for the transition we're in, the political transition from one commission to the next, that we keep that also for the next kind of, political setup with the institutions and newly elected parliament and new commission, that we keep that kind of compass for us, the digital decade, because they are all very relevant. Without kind of, a public administration that goes digital, we will not have the super roaming moment of the, for instance, digital wallets that we could get, Without digitalization of business, we will not kind of, move everybody into the cloud and, what we really need, or into AI, what we need for the innovation. Without digital skills, we will be limited in kind of, for instance, operating the supercomputers that we want to build. And nothing can be done if you don't have the high quality digital connectivity. And this is the construction side that we need to address in the next mandate, because that is not yet there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of I would say the biggest challenges in the digital decade is the goal of doubling the market share in semiconductors that are built in Europe. And this is something you mentioned before, because it's very much related with the idea of ensuring economic security of Europe. I guess many people don't remember, but during the pandemic, there was a moment in which suddenly there was a shortage of chips, of semiconductors. And this is what I think led you to then enact this policy to make sure that if something like that happens, so a shortage in the world market, will not be in the hands of other countries. We'll have at least some capacity to build them here in Europe. But I find it a big challenge. To be honest, I don't know how that's going, that goal.
I think this is part of a bigger kind of realization that really was triggered, as you said very well, from the COVID crisis and then also the war times, the dependencies that we were so happily and in a very naive way accepting in I would call it the happy days of globalization, or the naivety that everything is all going to be fine. Well, it's not. Geopolitics have changed, and we have lived through supply chain shortages that were hurting us. And that's why, there's a different realization that economic security is key. We want to remain open to the world because we are very big exporters and we need to keep markets open. But nevertheless, there needs to be a certain autonomy that needs to be from a strategic point of view, whether it's on raw materials, whether it's kind of in energy, whether it's kind of in chips, absolutely needed. And I think that's why a concept such as the CHIPS Act, which kind of, means we work better together on that. We invest also in very kind of, chips production in Europe. And you've seen the trend. I mean, there is more and more investment coming back. It's of course happening elsewhere as well. It's the same that happens in the US. But I think we have to be part of that race. And I think that's the same on raw materials, the same on kind of looking at different ways, to deal with energy. I mean, look at how much we got out of the energy dependency from Russia. So these have been very, very important lessons learned for the European Union in the last couple of years to really kind of stand up more be more assertive on what we need in the EU to really kind of survive whatever kind of drastic crisis situation might arise.
Well, Renate, I'll let you go. Before that, let me just ask a quick question on the future, because I think it makes sense to end on that. So as listeners already understood, there was a lot of policy drafting in the in the last years, and now those policies are there. At least most of them, I guess, are out there. So will your role change? So will the job of EU institutions and DG Connect in particular towards digital change in the next years, in the next mandate?
Inevitably, we will have a stronger focus on effective implementation. I think, it's great to have a Brussels effect that we discussed, but we cannot only kind of, have an image as the tech regulator that comes up with good rules. We have to show that these rules are effectively enforced and have an impact. And I think when you look at the last couple of months where we had, the first kind of months of enforcement of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, that's exactly what we are doing. We really kind of, pick it up with the platforms. We open investigation, we change their behavior, we kind of address shortcomings, we deal with their risk assessments. And I think the same will have to come from the AI Act and, to really make sure this is a very good cooperation at the European level with the national level that we really effectively enforce that. And an additional point, I think effective enforcement of some of the rules, which are more enabling rules. We spoke about the Data Act that has a huge potential for business, but here, business needs to be helped, that they actually use that potential, that they actually kind of open space for interesting contractual models so that users can share the data. So again,
interesting. They need
it's
to
really,
be nudged in a sense. Yeah.
for me, it's a key game changer that we look at kind of these more future-oriented, principle-based rules in a much more proactive way. When the story is not over, when it's published in the official journal, that's just when another chapter is opening, a chapter of effective enforcement, joint cooperation with industry and the stakeholders to really make it work. And we should always be guided by the objective. It needs to have an impact. It's good to have laws, but they need to have an impact. And I think that will be one of the key messages. It doesn't mean that we can't do, fill the gaps or recast and, look at some of the rules which might not be fit for purpose, work on connectivity. We have done a white paper. So there will be new areas of work, but I think effective implementation in a proactive kind of, way, that's for me a key game changer for the next commission.
Yeah, good. Renate, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. Bye.
Este episódio foi editado por Hugo Oliveira. Contribua para a continuidade e crescimento deste projeto no site 45grauspodcast.com. Selecione a opção Apoiar para ver como contribuir, diretamente ou através do Patreon, bem como os benefícios associados a cada modalidade.